Hi, and welcome to Plugged In, the Odgers Berndtson gaming series where we glean insights from industry leaders and innovators. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Lisa Opie, who is Managing Director of Ubisoft Reflections and Ubisoft Leamington Studios. Lisa was new to the games industry in 2020. Prior to that, she was Managing Director of Production for BBC Studios, whose raft of titles include Doctor Who, Top Gear, Strictly Come Dancing, and many more. And Lisa has been a force of good in the industry since she's joined. I do remember seeing a games industry biz article in, I think, earlier this year, Lisa, which I think was titled that you were helping to fix the games industry. So yeah, it's quite big shoes to fill, I guess. And today I am speaking to Lisa to ask her what she feels the biggest challenge facing the games industry is.
So thank you very much for that, and I regret the headline about fixing the industry. It's an industry in amazingly good shape, and one I'm incredibly fortunate to work in. And I have been here literally for about 10 minutes, but I have learned so much about creativity, about innovation over the course of the last sort of 14 months or so than I ever dreamt possible. And I think it's very, very easy for people, especially those people over the age of 35, to forget that actually video games is the most successful and popular entertainment forum in the world. And actually it's in rude health. There's so much creativity, and I think, you know, coming from the TV sector, it's quite easy to just sort of not realize that there is the breadth of creative content that there is available to players. So starting point, you know, what are its challenges? Well, it's in really rude health to start off with, but I suppose, you know, you could pick a lot of challenges that you share everywhere else, in fact. So, you know, the cost of living crisis is a real issue for us in the game sector, as it is for anybody else. And that gives us challenges. Future of work, you know, how do people relate to coming to work and being in an office? You know, are we going to get people back into our studios? What's the impact on productivity and creativity if increasingly people work from home? We did brilliantly in COVID, but it's still a challenge to work out how you engage physically with your teams. So those are really big challenges anyway, not to mention, you know, all of the normal things that you see in every other industry. Skills, we're in because we're in rude health, there is a demand for talent, and increasingly there's an international demand for talent because you know, before COVID, who knew that you could simply have somebody working at home in Wales or wherever else they may be, but work for a San Francisco company, a studio. So that has given us challenges as well, I think, that we will need to grapple. But probably one of the ones that's closest to my heart is that I think the games industry is a very young industry. It's grown up very quickly over the course of the last 30 or so years. And at the moment, it's not very diverse. And I think, you know, one of our greatest challenges is to work out how we bring in a greater mix of people into our business to ensure that the content we make is as relevant as it possibly can be.
And that is the critical part, isn't it? It's the production of content that is as far-reaching as it possibly can be. Clearly, for some gaming studios, they have a very specific target audience, and that is the same for any industry, of course. But actually, you know, there's an underserved market that are screaming out to be able to play more games and for more games to be developed for them. You know, I think it's diversity as a topic. It rightly so has received more attention than ever across all sectors over the last 2 years. And everyone, or we would hope everyone, is more understanding about, you know, the absolute critical nature of improving diversity. But I think it often feels that people are aware and concerned about the problem, but it slowly gets nudged down that critical to-do list because it's not an easy fix. It's certainly not a fast fix. So why do you feel it's so critical for the games industry, you know, outside of just not just the player experience and development, but internal and culture?
So I'm a very a big fan of Matthew Said's Rebel Ideas. It's absolutely brilliant. And he talks really compellingly about the power of thinking differently. Software development's really difficult. Making games is difficult, especially when you compare it with making television programs, where people have been making programs for, I don't know how many decades, but many decades. And everybody kind of knows what the role is and where you're going. It's really clear. Whereas in games development, it's iterative, it's challenging. You're always trying to innovative, and you're never entirely in control, because players will play the game in the way that they want to play it. So I recognize it's really, really difficult. And I think because it's hard, what happens over the last 30 or so years is that teams who work well together and are successful together and can shortcut and speak a specific language together clearly are valued within the industry. But sometimes, I guess, it's about how you bring in different voices and do they help you solve problems slightly differently. So I think as a sort of first order challenge, for me, it's does fresh thinking give you another route to solving a problem, frankly. But then, as you said, it's also about how do you ensure that you're appealing to your audiences. Gen Zs, we know, value authenticity more than anybody else. So delivering authenticity, delivering content that's relevant to our players, I think is really important. Content that they see themselves in and they feel is sort of part of their lives, that they're reflected in. So I think from that perspective, it's really important. But these things will take a long time to fix. It's because we have been operating in that way for quite a long time. And in terms of the content we create brilliant content. But I think going forward, what we first off need to do is to make sure that we create workplaces that are inclusive, workplaces where people, no matter what their background, feel that they can speak up. And that's absolutely the first and probably the most simple step that we can take to make sure that our games and the way that we make our games and the process that we use enable to people to speak up and have their say and be heard and have a voice in the games that we make. So that's the sort of starting point, I think. And then there are various ways in which you can shift the dial, but it's not something that will happen overnight.
Yeah, and it's difficult because it's one of those things that you want it to be one size fits all, but in actual fact, it's not, unfortunately. And there are lots of quirks to different studios and businesses about how to go about this in the most effective way. Inclusivity, as you said, is so vital because you can have the diversity, but clearly if it isn't an inclusive culture, then that diverse cohort aren't going to stay in role. And I was speaking to a chief people officer last week, I think it was, and we were saying about how difficult it is to measure inclusivity. It's very, very difficult, and it's a subjective thing. But their view was that actually, if you do a pulse survey within the organisation or the studio that you work in, that is entirely anonymous, versus actually the data that people have chosen to share with HR around sexuality, around gender, around ethnicity, you can often get a good sense of inclusivity depending on how much that data differs in terms of stats overall, because you can see where people are comfortable sharing that information about themselves in an open way versus in a confidential way. And if there's a big gap, then you've probably got quite a big problem.
I think that's really interesting. There's a great piece of research that I was reading recently. It came out literally a few months back, that points out that in fact, you can be as diverse as you like, but if you're not inclusive in the way that you operate and behave, then you won't achieve that change. There is a critical number of people that you need in order to allow people to have their voice and feel free and able to speak up. So one woman on the team doesn't really solve the problem, because in fact, if that woman doesn't feel empowered to speak up, you're not going to have shifted the dial. So I think it's really important that people feel that they have a sense of belonging, without a doubt.
And it's, talking about around a board table or whatever it might be in that sort of situation. You know, everyone is forever asking me about how to shift the dial in terms of executive teams. And that's a difficult question to answer because clearly, you know, it's a grassroots problem in reality. However, there are definitely things that we can do to be more inclusive and more willing to look at diverse options for certain roles. And I think, you know, the assumption wrongly is that is positive discrimination when it is absolutely not. It's positive action, and it's not about giving somebody a role whereby they can't perform. Actually, what it's doing is really thinking about, you know, you have a list of 10 absolute must-haves for an executive hire. Are all those 10 things must-haves, or actually are 7 of those things must-haves? And then does that then open you up to looking at a more diverse cohort? You know, it's things like, certainly within gaming, if you look at an exec team, I can often be speaking to people and they say, you know, we need this many years of experience within free to play, or we need this many years experience in MMO world. And it's questioning, well, actually, do you need that? Because if you've got that level of expertise in the business and that's what you specialize in, and somebody coming from a different background, one may mean that you can increase diversity, but equally diversity of thought as well.
Yeah, completely. No, I recognise that entirely. I think the years of experience of doing, you know, of shipping a game, for example, is one of the things that you could, you know, there are other skills that people can bring to the table that are complementary and not necessarily the same. But I think, you know, I think there are things that the game sector can do to become more accessible to a wider and broader range of people. I think there is a perception gap. I think lots of people in the UK, for example, you know, players don't realise just how much is made in the UK, how many brilliant games are made here, how many studios there are. There's more than 750 game studios in the UK. They also don't necessarily understand what the roles are. So we're quite, and because we're a fairly young industry, unlike TV where everybody knows what a researcher does and everybody knows what a producer does, in the game sector, one studio may call a producer, you know, who does this one title, and then somebody else may call it another title. If you're looking at that from the outside and thinking, am I going to have a great career in this sector? If you can't even navigate your way through into going, well, what do you actually do? What does that mean? And you can't see that what you may be doing in 10 years' time or earning, actually. Whereas when you look at the NHS or you look, you know, medicine, if you look at law, you're much more likely to be able to go, and that's my career path, and that's what I could expect, and that's what I'll earn. So I think there's an obligation on us to be more open and accessible to, you know, because actually I think we have the ability to appeal and attract people who come from very different backgrounds, who love to play games, and for whom, you know, software development in another area may not be that exciting, but software development in games is really exciting. So I think there's an enormous opportunity. It is about being clear. It's about being accessible.
And the thing with that clarity is it affects, well, typically can affect women more so than men if that clarity isn't provided, because you know, there are so many studies out there that show that as a woman, you are far less likely to apply for a role if you feel that you only tick 70% of those boxes. Whereas as a man, you're probably very comfortable doing that. And, you know, that isn't a big assumption, but there is an awful lot of data to back that up. And I think if we're not transparent about what each role means across the industry and what it encompasses, then it's quite difficult for people to take a risk on themselves and really push themselves forward.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think that's across the board. So there are loads of things that we need to do with children in order to better help them understand that coding can be fun, that it's about problem solving, it's about creativity, it's exciting, it's actually critical to pretty much everything in your life. You know, it's everywhere, and I think it's a key part of what we need to do, and maybe parents too, to actually say there is an enormous breadth of creativity in the game sector. It isn't all single track male focused games. There's so much more. Rabbids, Just Dance, you know, the things that we make that are much broader in context. it's a brilliant way of learning. And I think, you know, trying to educate people to a certain extent about the value, about the creative cultural contribution of games, I think is really important too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure to speak to you today, Lisa. Thank you ever so much for taking the time out. Really appreciate it, and hope to speak soon.